Today is the day that freeze dryer nerds like myself get really excited because my Harvestright Oil Less pump finally got here today. Hey guys, it's Brian with Retired at 40. I've been freeze drying for almost 4 years now at this point, and I've had all kinds of different setups. I've had 2 different medium freeze dryers now. I now have the large. I've had the old JB Industries oiled pump. I've had the standard pump, and I've had the Premier pump a couple different times, and I've never had an oilless pump before, and I feel like if I'm gonna do this for pretty much what I do for a living now is make YouTube videos and everything surrounded by freeze drying, that I need to have all options in my arsenal of freeze drying equipment. So today we're going to do an unboxing of the Harvestright freeze dryer oilless pump. We're going to do a quick side-to-side comparison of the other pumps. I'm going to do my overall thoughts of the pump and my first impressions, if you will, and then we're going to run it through a test cycle. You can see the bands are still on here. I haven't opened it up yet, so let's do that right now. And I'm also planning on making another video that compares this head-to-head with the other models of pumps. So if you're interested in that, there will be one coming soon, or depending on when you see this video, it might already be out. If there is, I'll put a link in this video that I have right now. All right, here we go. Let's cut these bands and unleash the beast. And it looks like I got the upright version of the oilless, which, you know, either one would have been fine with me, but I do know what to expect out of this oilless. I know it's kind of tried and true, and I know its flaws and I know its benefits. So with that said, let's carry on. Okay, so first impression, it's extremely heavy. And I am not kidding, this thing is really heavy. In fact, I'm gonna put it on a scale because I want to see how heavy this thing is. So there you have it, 44.6 pounds. So let's get some quick stats on this before we put it side by side. So the height on this one is about 18.5 inches. At the widest point of this, it's about 10.5 inches. The overall silhouette of this is, I don't know, it's a little bit larger. And now seeing them side by side, you can see what I'm talking about. Really not a whole lot difference in the longest point of the Premier and the longest point of the oilless. It does sit upright, so it's a little bit hard to compare them, but really not a lot of difference. Let's see what the weight difference is. So the standard pump is 36.4 pounds. The Premier pump, 34.2 pounds. But I'll kind of get more into the side-by-side comparison. I'll compare every aspect in a future video. So let's just go over some quick specs on this oilless pump. It does run just on your basic 110 power cord. That obviously plugs into the back of the freeze dryer. It's 115 volts, 550 watts, 7 CFM. It's going to have the same fittings as any of the other pumps offered. It's just going to plug directly into the hose that comes with your freeze dryer. So even if this is an upgrade for you, it's going to use the same everything that you already have. The only difference is the pump. But as I'm looking over this, I'm kind of noticing a couple things that I don't recognize. They don't look familiar to me, so let's look into those. The first one being this little guy right here. And this looks similar to the ballast that they offer on some of the standard pumps and on the Premier pump as well, but it does have, it looks like, it reminds me of a plumbing fitting. They call this a bleeder valve. They use it for condensation or extra water. So after looking at the manual, it says this is an air flush valve assembly. So we can figure this out when we run our first batch on it. I would imagine it has something to do with flushing moisture out of the pump. Obviously you don't want water sitting at the base of this. So on the other side of this, there's also another type of inlet, and this is referred to an inlet assembly in the manual. What that is exactly, I don't know. I think again, once we run this through its first cycle, we'll probably be able to tell. But before we do that, I want to talk about some of the benefits and then maybe some of the flaws or some of the downside of an oilless pump. The first benefit is very, very obvious to me. There's little to no maintenance on these. You're not dealing with oil. This is as close as you're going to get to hands off as far as the pump goes. You know, there's really no maintenance until there is. There's no oil changes. There's no flushes. There's no anything like that. On the flip side of that, that could be one of the flaws, because anything that doesn't have lubrication is creating more friction than something that does. So over time, with more friction, you might have more maintenance, you know, over the course of years, more than you would with an oiled pump, because those parts are going to tend to possibly wear out faster. So is that the case with this oilless pump? You know, I've seen both sides of it. I've seen people that have run their pump 24/7 for years and years and years, and it's still going strong. I've seen other people that, you know, after a couple years or 3 years, that it just has to be rebuilt, and that sounds like a major thing. But if you're considering the amount of abuse that this pump takes, especially for someone who's running this 24/7, they're turning over cycles as fast as they can. You know, think about if your car was running 24/7. Eventually, it's going to need some kind of maintenance, and this is no exception. This pump also does include a 1-year warranty, and the warranty says that it will cover repair, replacement, or a credit at the invoice price. And the no oil and no oil changes, that's a huge upside for many people, because if you're not handy or you just don't want to mess with it, that, you know, that could be worth the extra cost just by itself. I want to share an important piece of information regarding the price, which is pretty much the biggest hump or obstacle that people have with the oilless pump. That being, the oilless pump is a pretty huge upgrade. It can take your already expensive freeze dryer and make it just that much more expensive. Right now, I think it's a $1,500 to $1,700 upgrade, somewhere in there at the time of this video. And if you compare this oilless pump to any other oilless pump that you can get commercially that would actually do what it needs to do for the freeze dryer, anything that's comparable to this is going to be probably at least twice as much money as this oilless pump. I've said this before, and I'll say it again, that Harvestright does things that they don't necessarily have to do. They went and they rebranded a pump and put their own name on it, and then they sell it to their customers for a lot less than you could get a commercial pump for. And with that said, I want to mention that I am not paid by Harvestright for any of the stuff that I do. I'm a Harvestright affiliate, which means if you order products through my affiliate link, I earn a commission from Harvestright, but I am not paid directly from Harvestright to promote any of their products. I'm an affiliate for Harvestright because I believe in their product. I've been using the product. I pay for the products with my own money. So for me, it's easy to promote something that I already use, that I already love, that I've used for many years now. And then I take those commissions and I put them back into our freeze drying channel. I put them back into giveaways on our Facebook and our MeWe pages. I put it back into product development for items in our store. I use it for things that benefits the entire freeze drying community. So enough about that, but I just wanted to bring it up because it has been coming up in past videos, in comments, and things like that. And also, if you're running some kind of commercial operation, or even not a commercial operation, if you have multiple freeze dryers going, you're not having to worry about oil contamination, which brings us to our next point for the oilless pump. If you're in some sort of field like laboratory or commercial freeze drying in some sense, then you might not be able to even have an oiled vacuum pump to do that process. Certain regulations or governing agencies or whatever, they might require you to have an oilless pump. I wouldn't let that be your deciding factor as just a home freeze dryer, because I don't think it's really that big a deal. But if you're in a commercial setting or in a laboratory setting, it might be something to think about. Another thing that I've heard throughout the groups is the amount of heat that this puts off. It does obviously run more hot than an oiled pump would, because it doesn't have that lubrication. It doesn't have that extra level of cooling. To me, I don't think that's anything, you know, a fan blowing on this won't fix. And it does say right here in the manual, normal operating temperature is approximately 130 degrees Fahrenheit, which is hot to the touch. And then it also says that it can run hotter than that, so keep that in mind with your surroundings of where this is going to go, because that may be the determining factor as well. If it's close to something that's flammable, if it's in a very confined space, maybe the oilless is not for you. Another thing to think about is the amount of noise this produces in comparison with the other pumps. I'll dive deeper on that in my comparison video. But being a former owner of the old JB Industries pump that they used to make with the older freeze dryers, it can't be as loud as that thing was, and I survived. I used it almost daily and I was fine. But in comparison to the other pumps, we'll have to see. So I think the next thing that we need to do is get this thing hooked up, and we need to run it through a cycle. And make sure that your pump is switched to the on position before you do this. But before I get too carried away, I would like to do a vacuum test on it. I want to make sure that it's doing what it needs to be doing before I actually put it through a cycle. So to do that, you just need to hit this green leaf right here. That'll take you to this functional testing screen. And then you can hit the vacuum on button. That's going to send a signal to your pump. So in preparation for our comparison video, I also got a decibel meter. I got a decent one instead of just using my phone this time. So why don't we use that while we're doing this as well. I'll do one reading from 10 feet away, and then I'm going to do another reading with the door closed outside of the room. So outside of the freeze drying room, you really can't hear a whole lot of anything. It just sounds like just a little something, not that big a deal. So if you know anything about decibels, very small differences in decibels mean a huge difference overall. I encourage you to do some research on it. So outside of the freeze drying room really didn't sound very loud at all. The freeze dryer itself is not on yet, just the pump. And the experience that I have with the other pumps is that the freeze dryer itself is actually a little bit louder than the pump. This one I don't really feel like it's super loud, but we will dive a little deeper, like I said, in the comparison video. We can actually put them head to head. All right, so we're good to go. I took it down to 3,000 millitorrs, so our vacuum test is good. We should be good to freeze dry now. So my first impressions, just the ability to grab and go and just continuously do cycles without having to worry about oil changes, worrying if your oil level is okay, not really having to worry about this pump in any way, just being able to throw in food and just start the process. It's something you could definitely get used to. I can see the appeal of it for sure. All right, so we'll call this oilless test number 1. So food's all loaded up. This is gonna be my first test with the oilless. We'll see how this all fares. So our cycle's getting really close to being done, and I've noticed a couple of things. One is when I walk into this room now with this running, you can really feel the heat that this thing puts out. I have put a fan on this thing, and it seems like it's running a lot cooler. It's cool to the touch. You can actually touch it, but this does put out a lot more heat than the other pumps that I'm used to. The other thing that's really noticeable to me, just because I'm used to running the Premier pump all the time, which is really quiet, is it does put out some more noise. I'm not gonna say that it's annoying, because when you step outside of the actual freeze drying room where I have this, which is in my utility room in a basement, it's not as noticeable, but when you step inside this room, you can definitely tell the difference. So I had to add some more time back onto my cycle of what I'm freeze drying, so I had to start the pump back up again, and I think I figured out what this little inlet is for. That may look bad, but I think the purpose of this valve is to kind of get rid of any moisture that's built up, condensation, because this is water. And it's black water right now, probably because there's still gunk left in there from when they made it. Time will tell on that, but this is definitely a water that it's trying to get rid of, so it doesn't sit down at the bottom and corrode all these parts down at the bottom of the pump. And while this is running, if you open up this valve, you can see there's some moisture on my hands as well. It will kind of spit out any remaining moisture. There's a couple drops down here as well. So I think with those couple extra measures on that pump, I think that will definitely help the longevity of the pump. But really what you're probably wanting from this video is, should I buy the oilless pump? Should I spend the extra money? So I think in order to figure that out, you need to ask yourself a handful of questions. The first one being noise. And if you live in a house and you have an area where you can put this pump, if you have a basement or a mechanical room, utility room, something like that, I'm actually sitting outside of where my pump is at right now, in a straight line, probably 20 feet away. You can't even hear it. It's kind of just background noise. But if you live in an apartment or a townhome or something that has shared walls, I don't think that this pump is for you. That's something that's going to be a case-by-case basis, of course. And we'll go deeper into that in the comparison video, which I'll release soon. The next thing that you need to ask yourself is, can you justify the extra cost? If you're already on the fence of whether or not you're going to buy a freeze dryer, the cost of the freeze dryer is a pretty good chunk of change, and adding another $1,700 on top of that is something that you definitely need to weigh out your options on, whether you can justify that extra cost. And another small factor to take into consideration is the energy efficiency. I know that the Premier pump, which is also an upgrade, but a lesser upgrade than the oilless pump, I know that that one is a little bit more energy efficient than the oilless would be, and probably more efficient than the standard pump as well. It uses a DC motor that converts the AC into DC, which is part of the reason why that pump runs so smooth and quiet. I think another big thing that you need to consider is the area that your freeze dryer and your pump are going to go into. Mainly because that pump puts out a pretty good amount of heat, and if you already are in a confined space and you don't have the room to let that pump breathe, you don't have the area to circulate some air around that somehow, that's something that you're going to need to take into consideration. Okay, so that's enough cons. Let's talk about the pros. The pros can be pretty huge if they apply to you. So I mentioned this earlier, but not having to change the oil and really just having minimal maintenance in general, it's something that you could definitely get used to very easy. The practice of freeze drying can be quite a bit of work if you're doing large batches of things. You're cooking, you're preparing food, you're getting everything onto trays, then you have the cleanup. And for some people, it might not be worth it to add on the extra task of changing oil and just a little bit of extra maintenance here and there. Or maybe just the thought of any kind of maintenance or picking up any tools to change oil, do stuff like that. Maybe that's just not in your vocabulary. But I will say this, freeze drying in general, you do have to be at least a little bit handy or technical, because it's not a completely smooth process all the time. Things happen, and you have to be willing to troubleshoot. You have to be able to think outside the box sometimes. So with all of this said, I can't make the decision for you, but I can give you as much information as possible. And just from my experiences in freeze drying, this is my first experience with freeze drying with an oilless. I do like it. I think the pump is great. Whether you can justify the cost, that would be up to you. Or maybe you're in the particular setting where you have to have an oilless pump, whether it's commercial or laboratory. And the appeal of little to no maintenance is huge, whether you're in that setting or you're just freeze drying at home. I hope all this information was helpful, guys. I really appreciate you watching this all the way through. Make an informed decision, and hopefully I was able to do that. If you think this was a good review, please just do me a favor, give me a thumbs up. It helps the YouTube algorithm get this video out to the people that really need to see it. It'll be helpful for those people. And make sure you stay tuned for that comparison video if you're really looking for a pump. I'm going to compare the standard, the Premier, and the oilless side by side. And until next time, this is Retired at 40, reminding you to live life simple. We'll catch you next week.